Hi everyone. Today we're going to be reading about cash crops, the Carolinas, and slavery. Just a brief review before I start reading though. Think about who was the English colonists largely responsible for the survival of the colonists at Jamestown. Hopefully you're thinking about John Smith. Which Native American group did the settlers interact with at Jamestown? And hopefully Powhatan comes to mind. According to one version, which Powhatan pleaded with her father, Chief Powhatan, to spare John Smith's life. You could have said Pocahontas, Matoaka, or Rebecca. All three of those are the same person, just known at different times as different people. What types of challenges did the colonists at Jamestown face? Well, you could say illness or sickness. You could say the different climate from England. You could say the brackish water, the lack of food and supplies, the fires in the settlement, the tension with the Native Americans, the desire to hunt for gold rather than work. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, the colonists ran out of food and many died. What was this time called? Hopefully you're thinking the starving time. Who, when the Jamestown colonists thought all was lost, came with 3 ships filled with supplies? That would have been Lord Delaware. What crops did the colonists at Jamestown start growing that saved their colony? Remember, it wasn't a food, it was tobacco. And who helped guide and lead the growing of this crop? John Rolfe and the Powhatan. So today I want you to listen carefully to the different types of crops that help form the economy of the southern colonies. As you heard, John Rolfe is well known for marrying Chief Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, also known as Matoaka, and for making Jamestown, and therefore the Virginia colony, an important economic center. John Rolfe did this by growing and exporting tobacco, and then shipping it out of the area to places that wanted to buy it. Well, you might be thinking, yuck, tobacco means smoking, and we all know that's very unhealthy. Even land-greedy King James thought so. He once said that smoking is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. However, because many people still wanted tobacco and were willing to pay for it, tobacco became a huge part of the southern colony's economy. The Spanish were the first to bring tobacco to Europe from the Americas. They discovered the Native Americans in various parts of Central and South America used tobacco in a variety of ways. It was chewed, smoked, used as a medicine, and was an important part of many religious ceremonies. In fact, when Christopher Columbus first set foot in the New World, he was greeted by local natives carrying gifts of fruits, spears, and dried leaves that had a strong fragrance. Those leaves were tobacco. And remember, we talked about tobacco being used in the peace pipes of the Native Americans when they'd sit down to talk things over. When the English arrived in North America, they too found that many Native Americans grew and used tobacco. The English settlers' get-rich plan had not succeeded when they failed to find their gold. Some settlers also experimented with growing crops such as rice and grapes, but they too were unsuccessful. However, John Rolfe, with the guidance of the Powhatan, made a pivotal or important contribution to the doomed Jamestown economy. Wealthy Europeans were beginning to develop a taste for tobacco. However, much of the tobacco being shipped to Europe had a bitter taste. John Rolfe introduced a new tobacco plant to the fields around Jamestown. He brought in a less bitter-tasting plant from the West Indies. Actually, he brought the seeds in to see if they'd grow. It was an experiment, and it worked. The new tobacco plants grew and flourished in the red Virginia soil. So the much milder tasting Virginia tobacco became much sought after. Its increased use among the growing number of English smokers transformed or changed the colony's economy. Jamestown became a place of wealth and enterprise. Shiploads of Englishmen and women eagerly set off to make their fortune there. The gold that the early settlers had sought turned out to be in the form of an odorous plant. Many people became wealthy as a result of growing this cash crop. And a cash crop is a large amount of produce grown to make money rather than to be used or eaten by those who grow it. No doubt if you had been there in Jamestown, you might have heard the sound of gold coins jingling in the colonists' pockets. Tobacco was so popular that by 1619, it was Virginia's main crop. Within 50 years, the colony exported about 15 million pounds of it to Europe. Eventually, tobacco was such a widespread cash crop that the governor had to remind the settlers to actually grow food crops as well. With the success of the tobacco industry, the future of Jamestown was finally secured. However, there was one major drawback to growing tobacco. Back then, a lot of people were needed who were willing to work very, very hard to tend the large plantations, and people like that weren't easy to find. In the beginning, the new tobacco farmers had mostly indentured servants working for them. Indentured servants were people who agreed to come to Virginia and eventually to other parts of North America to work for a period of time for a specific person. The agreed upon time was usually about 7 years. Often these indentured servants were poor people from England or other parts of Europe whose ship passage was purchased for them by their employer. Then as soon as they arrived at their new homes, the indentured servants were put to work. They were not paid for their work. Instead, they had received the transportation to the New World, lodging, clothing, and food. These indentured servants labored long and hard in the tobacco fields, and after the agreed upon time of service was up, and if they were still alive after the hardships they had endured, they were free to venture out on their own. In 1619, though, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown with what is believed to have been the first 20 Africans brought to North America. According to some historical accounts, these Africans were brought to North America as indentured servants, and they may have worked along the white indentured servants. However, as the colony developed, there became a serious shortage of workers, and colonists believed that the use of slavery was the most efficient way to manage the plantations. Before long, thousands of Africans were brought into the colonies against their will and forced to work. Remember, the English had begun to lay claim to large areas of North America. After all, the Spanish were claiming most of Central and South America, and even southern North America. And the French had claimed most of northern North America. The English thought it was only fair they claim a huge chunk of land too. As you recall, England's very first attempt to colonize North America was on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina, but it failed and was known as the Lost Colony. But in 1663, Charles II, the son of Charles I and grandson of King James I, decided to try again near the same area. Charles II eagerly gave a charter or official document to 8 of his friends that stated the land between Virginia and the Spanish colony of Florida now belonged to him, well, to England to be precise. Today this land is North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, although Georgia was not officially colonized until much later. Charles II also named part of this land after himself. Carolina means of Charles. This charter was extended to 1665, and more land was divided up among his friends to manage. Charles II was particularly generous to those who had helped his family when his father Charles I was killed. At that time, Charles II had been forced to flee to another country. When Charles II was eventually allowed to return to England and take the throne, he owed a great deal of money to a great many people. His way out of debt was to give them North America, or at least parts of it. Having heard how successful Jamestown was, hundreds and even thousands of English flocked to the South and to the Carolinas in particular. In 1670, a busy seaport was established in Charlestown, who was, of course, named after King Charles himself. In the beginning, many colonists in the Carolinas established small farms. Before long, though, large plantations replaced these small farms for the purpose of growing cash crops. The top 3 cash crops in the area were rice, tobacco, and indigo. Over here, guys. The warm climate and marshy stretches of land with fewer trees in the Carolinas were perfect for growing rice and indigo, whereas tobacco thrived in certain parts of North Carolina. With drier land and more trees, the geography and climate of Virginia was not conducive or helpful to growing rice and indigo. Tobacco remained the only cash crop in Jamestown. As in Virginia, it soon became clear that there was a lot of money to be made in the Carolinas by growing crops. Many more workers would be needed. Unfortunately, the solution the colonists chose was to use slavery extensively. As you can imagine, no volunteers were there to be enslaved. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans did not come to North America of their own free will as a part of an exchange agreement, nor did they ever have hope of being set free. So instead, they were taken by force. The roots of slavery go deep into the past. Throughout history, powerful people have enslaved less powerful people. Although England began trading enslaved Africans later than some other European countries, it soon became one of the biggest slave trading countries due to the widespread use of slavery in the English colonies. For England, the slave trade was part of a larger trade network among Europe, West Africa, and North America, including the colonies and the West Indies. Some of these trade routes became known as the triangular trade route. If you look at this map, you can see why. You go here to Africa, over to here, and back again. Okay, so you can see the triangle it makes. Through these triangular trade networks, certain goods were traded for other much needed items. Enslaved Africans were part of the network. English-laden ships with iron products, especially guns, arrived in the West African ports to trade their goods for slaves and gold. Africans who had become enslaved had previously lived freely in Africa, but became victims of kidnapping by slave raiders. Many of these raiders were Africans armed with guns supplied by European slave traders. Enslaved Africans were considered to be valuable workers. Captured Africans were loaded onto ships destined for parts of North America. This slave route from West Africa to North America became known as the Middle Passage. Let me go back to show you what the Middle Passage would be, guys. This part would be the Middle Passage, okay? If the West Indies was their final destination, enslaved Africans were exchanged for goods such as molasses and sugar, and then were transported to the southern colonies. Many others stayed on the ship and were taken to the colonies along with the goods. Although there were enslaved Africans in all parts of the 13 English colonies, most of them were sent to the South. This was because most farms in the Middle Atlantic and New England regions were smaller and more easily managed by families. However, some enslaved Africans in the cities worked in houses and shops as servants or skilled artisans or craftsmen. The business of enslaving and shipping captured African men, women, and children was a gruesome or terrible one. Captured Africans were packed like cargo onto ships where there was hardly enough room to move. Many were chained together or to parts of the ship. Very little food and water was provided, and conditions were extremely unsanitary or unclean or unhealthy. There was usually no medical assistance for those who became sick. The journey itself could take 6 to 10 weeks to complete. The Africans had no idea where they were going or if they would survive the journey. Although enslaved Africans were valued for their labor, the traders believed that there was an endless supply of these workers. Therefore, if some died along the way, the traders thought they could be easily replaced. Many captured Africans died before they even reached the Americas. When those who did survive reached the shore, they were marched off the ship in chains to be examined by prospective buyers and then sold at auctions. There was little regard for the humanity of these African men, women, and children. The main objective was to put them to work on plantations to make a lot of money for the Europeans. Okay, guys. Miss you. Talk to you soon. Bye.